We're really excited about starting our Jonah series with you today. I want you to know before any of us pastors stand before you to preach, we all have our special disciplines and holy practices. Well, Wally joined me for my spiritual practice this week. I want to give you a glimpse on how I prepared for today's worship service right now. So I'm sure that inspired a lot of confidence in you. We all love fish stories, and most of us have whoppers, don't we? The last time Monica and I were out fishing was on the Fayette Reservoir, and we were out on the boat with her brother, and it was a great morning. Well, at least for them it was, because they were reeling in one bass after the other. For 2 solid hours, I didn't even get a nibble. So I finally put the last mud dog on the end of my hook, cast my line as far out as I possibly could, and it went off course, of course, over a dead tree in the middle of the lake, and my line went up and over one of the branches 6 feet above the water, and my mud dog plopped into the water. And it was just how my day was going. So I started reeling it back in ever so slowly, trying not to snag it on the tree branch. And just as that mud dog cleared the water, the biggest bass imaginable came jumping up out of the water, landed on my poor mud dog, and took it back under with him. And the fight was on. I saw my rod just bend right on over, and I started pulling as hard as I could, and I started yelling to Monica and her brother to move the boat closer. After all, my line was over the tree branch, but they weren't paying attention to me. Monica was busy catching her own fish, and her brother, believe it or not, was on the cell phone talking to their sister about what they were going to have for breakfast. Nobody was paying attention to me. So I did my very best, and I tired that fish out, and I just about had him up out of the water. It was so big, I can't even begin to describe it. And as it came up out of the water, it gave one last wiggle and dropped back into freedom. Well, I tell you, at that moment, I was not a happy pastor. I turned to my bride and her brother, and I said, "What happened to you guys? Why didn't you help me? Didn't you see that huge fish?" And they looked at me kind of with a puzzled look and said, "What fish?" Her brother-in-law, my brother-in-law, sends me a picture of that dead tree out in the middle of Fayette Lake every now and then, just to remind me of what a good time we had on the lake together. We all love fish stories, and we're going to love going through the book of Jonah. Kids, you're going to love this series as well. Jonah is a story that I think we can all relate to, and it's a story not just about a big fish, though. As we get into it, we're going to discover that this story is even more than just about Jonah. This story, this sermon series, is about everyone who's ever run from God in their lives, anybody who's ever resisted the destiny that God has for them. You see, Jonah is the story of all of us, as we will see. So we catch up with the story of Jonah in the first chapter when we read these words. "The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. So we see in the life of Jonah the most famous and colorful example of someone who has run away from God. God came to Jonah with a very special job for him to do and told him, "I need you to go to Nineveh and preach against it." So Jonah was to leave his hometown near Nazareth and just travel up to Nineveh and deliver the word of the Lord. Well, this must have sent shudders up and down Jonah's spine, because Nineveh was set deep within the Assyrian Empire. It was a huge city settled in an empire that was known for its barbaric cruelty as well as torture of its enemies. And so may not surprise you that even though Jonah was the first round draft pick of God for this special mission that he didn't sing with Michael, "Here am I, Lord, send me." No, absolutely not. Jonah did just the opposite. He ran from God. He went the other way. So get this, just to be clear, Jonah went up to Joppa to buy a one-way ticket to Tarshish. So God had asked Jonah to go to Nineveh. Jonah instead went to Tarshish. God had asked Jonah to go 500 miles to the east. Jonah instead took a boat to take him 2,000 miles to the west. God had asked Jonah to go to the right. Jonah had decided to go to the left. God had asked Jonah to do a special job and go. Jonah said no. Jonah refused to embrace the destiny that God had for him. Maybe it was because it was a flagrant act of rebellion, or maybe he was just terrified of the Assyrians and the Ninevites. Whatever the reason, Jonah decided to run from God, and we find ourselves even in the life of Jonah. Let's go a little bit deeper in the stories, and you'll see what I'm talking about. We read in verse 4, "Then the Lord," as Jonah's on the boat, he's headed to Tarshish, running from God and running from the destiny that God has for him. "Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell asleep into a deep sleep." Running from God is pretty exhausting, isn't it? So the sailors went down, found Jonah asleep, woke him up, asked him what he was doing, asked him who his God was. They started praying to his God, and then they threw Jonah overboard in order to save their lives. They didn't realize that they were actually saving Jonah's life as well. And that's where the big fish comes into our story. So kids out there watching with me today, I want to share the story of Jonah in Dr. Seuss fashion. I know a lot of you love Dr. Seuss, and John Ortberg, who's a wonderful pastor, had written the story of Jonah in the way that Dr. Seuss would have told it. So God told Jonah, would you go to preach? Would you go to reach the people in Assyria, for you meet my criteria? And Jonah responds, "I would not go there in a boat. I would not go there in a float. I would not go there in a gale. I would not go there in a whale. I do not like the people there. If they all died, I would not care. I will not go to that great town. I'd rather choke. I'd rather drown. I will not go by land or sea, so stop this talk and let me be." Jonah, he ran from God in a very colorful and famous fashion, and we, like Jonah, can find ourselves in the very same place all too quickly. In fact, the renowned psychologist Abraham Maslow called our propensity, the strange tendency in us to run away from our destiny, as the Jonah complex. He says it's the self-sabotaging defense mechanism in us that keeps us from fulfillment or from success because we're too afraid, or we feel inadequate, or we feel unworthy. This is how Maslow says it. If you deliberately plan to be less than you are capable of being, then I warn you that you'll be unhappy the rest of your life. This happens to all of us, doesn't it? When we don't trust God's love for us, when we doubt His plan for our lives, and when we fail to embrace His dream, His destiny for you and me. The Jonah complex, I am all too familiar with it. You know, it was just a couple of years ago that I was here in Round Rock, having lunch with my lifelong friends, Will and Tina Cotton. Will, as you know, is our senior pastor here, and Monica and I were loving catching up with our friends. And we were also exploring the possibility of me coming to work on staff here at First Church. And frankly, the possibility thrilled me, because to be able to work alongside in the kingdom with my friends, what more could I ask for? But there was another part of that possibility that absolutely terrified me. You see, what could be more important than to share in the important work that you do, that sacred work in the kingdom of God? I would be responsible for proclaiming this word faithfully without compromise. I would be responsible for caring for God's precious children. I would be responsible for inspiring faith in the lives of others. And frankly, I just wasn't sure I had it in me. And spiritually speaking, I think I had traveled to Joppa, and I was at the ticket counter buying a one-way ticket to Tarshish in my life. And 2 months after I had started here, I was sitting in my office, and Will was sitting next to me, and I was pouring all this out in a sacred moment of honesty with him. I just didn't feel adequate. I didn't know if I had the tool sets to do it. I had just retired from the military. I'd had 5 deployments in my life. Frankly, on more than one occasion, I wondered if I would ever see my family again. But yet, the weight of responsibility of working in this church and in any church felt so much heavier and so much greater than anything I'd experienced before. It was very sacred to me. And so I told Will I didn't want to disappoint him. I didn't want to disappoint the church. And I certainly didn't want to disappoint God. Well, if you know our senior pastor, he listened very patiently to me. And finally, when I gave him a chance to speak, he looked at me and he reminded me of how God had woven our lives together across the years. He reminded me how uniquely gifted I was, and how God had prepared me for this moment and this time in our lives together. You see, Will believed in me, and his confidence in me cut through the fear and insecurity and inadequacy that I was feeling at the time. It cut through my Jonah complex, and I heard the message loud and clear: Pat, you were meant to be here. I know I'm not the only one. I know that all of us allow our fears and insecurities at times to get the best of us, and when they do, they can rob us of God's blessing and God's best for us in our lives. And if we're not careful, we're going to find ourselves far away from God's dream for us. We not only resist God's calling, but we find ourselves missing out on God's destiny for our lives as well. And if we're not careful, we're going to find ourselves lost at sea like Jonah was. Spiritual fugitives running from God, lost without peace and joy in our lives, and frankly, allowing our own disobedience to impact the lives of others, just as Jonah's disobedience impacted the lives of the sailors on the boat that he was with as well. Well, there's good news for us in the story of Jonah. And this is where I really get excited, because God provides a way. In verse 17 of the first chapter of Jonah, we read about when the fish comes into the story. The fish comes into the story so the other fish, you and me, won't get away. This is how Jonah writes it. But the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights. It's interesting in the Hebrew language in which the Old Testament was written, where it said the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah. The word provided there is actually the Hebrew word for appointed or destined. So God destined a great fish to rescue Jonah. The message here and the hope here is that God isn't done with Jonah. That God's not through with Jonah, that God's not going. When Jonah felt like he had breathed his life, and when he was thrown into the sea, he felt like his life was over. God wasn't done with him. And the good news for us, it's not done with us either. God provided for Jonah and God will provide for you and for me. No matter how lonely we feel, no matter how sinful we feel in our lives, no matter what we've done, no matter what's been done for us, no matter what we've refused to do, no matter how lost we feel, our God is always at work in our lives. Just like he was in Jonah's life, to provide a way of escape, to provide a future and a hope for us, to open a door for us for our destiny. Jonah discovered that as the big fish stepped into his life. Day, what would it be like for you and for me? How would our lives be transformed if we really believed that God was at work in our lives? What difference would it make in our lives if we, instead of running from God, we ran to God and embraced his dream and his destiny for our lives, rather than feeling inadequate and saying to ourselves we're not enough, that we trusted in God who is our help, who is more than enough. Rather than cowering in fear because of our own personal problems or even because of a global pandemic, we say instead that our God will make a way where there is no way. We make all sorts of excuses, don't we, in our lives, just as Jonah did in his life. Maybe it was an act of rebellion. Maybe it was because he feared the Ninevites. Either way, he decided he wasn't going to follow after God. And you and I do the same thing in our own lives. We use all sorts of excuses. We say to ourselves, well, just this once, I'll compromise who I am and what God's called me to do and be. Or we'll say to ourselves, someday I will follow God's will for my life. Someday I'll do what God asked me to do. We also use the excuses of hardships, and we use the excuses of circumstances. We say it's other people's fault, what they've done to us or what they didn't do for us. We even use COVID-19 as an excuse to disengage from our walk with God and our walk with each other. But God doesn't want us to live in fear. Instead of cowering behind our personal problems or even behind a global pandemic, God wants us to stand tall in courage and in faith, knowing that the God of yesterday, today, and tomorrow is a God that's with us now. He is the one who makes a way where there is no way. We cower in fear sometimes, and we use that excuse someday rather than saying, this day I will love the Lord with my God with all my heart, my soul, my strength. This day I will serve God. This day is my day of hope and victory. So rather than running away from God, the scriptures, even Jonah's story, tells us to run to him because our God is not done with us. And just like he pursued Jonah, so our God is going to pursue us. He's going to pursue us with his relentless love and mercy and grace. What a beautiful story it is in the life of Jonah. So just so that I'm clear today, your life is not so far gone that God cannot find you. Your sin is not so great that God cannot forgive you and restore you. Your family is not so broken that God can't bring healing and wholeness in your life and in your circumstances. You are not so far lost that God cannot find you. Your isolation and despair are not so deep that God can't fill your heart, your life with hope and with peace. Even in the face of death, even at the grave, we have hope. It was Jesus himself who told the story of Jonah and told us that he would die and raise just as Jonah had been in the belly of the whale, in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so our Lord would be dead but rise again from the dead, that we might have hope, that we might have life, that we might have a future. So my brothers and sisters today, rather than live a life where we're worried and filled with insecurity, rather than allowing the storms to get the best of us, why not instead run to the God who loves us, who provides a way when there seems to be no way? Our God will do anything to win us back to himself.